Trump's Monroe Doctrine backfires and Canada's response changes everything. On January 3rd, 2026, the United States military entered Venezuela and seized its president in the middle of the night. Within hours, Donald Trump stood at Mar-a-Lago and declared what he called the Monroe Doctrine, a plan for total American dominance over the entire Western Hemisphere. And then he said something that should terrify every Canadian watching this video. American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. The State Department's official account posted, "This is our hemisphere, and President Trump will not allow our security to be threatened." Our hemisphere, Canada, is in that hemisphere. So is Greenland. So is the Panama Canal. And Trump has already made clear he wants all of them. But here's what nobody expected. Within 72 hours of Trump's Venezuela declaration, Prime Minister Mark Carney made a series of moves that completely stunned the international community. Moves that signal Canada is no longer playing by the old rules. This is the story of how the United States just declared itself the supreme power over its neighbors, and how Canada responded by building an entirely new alliance system to protect itself. Let me take you through exactly what happened. To understand why this moment is so significant, you need to understand what just happened in Venezuela and what it means for every country in the Western Hemisphere, especially Canada. On January 3rd, 2026, American forces launched what they called Operation Absolute Resolve. They struck military installations across Venezuela, then helicopter-borne troops swooped into Caracas and captured President Nicolas Maduro and his wife while they slept. By the end of the day, both were in jail in New York, facing drug trafficking charges. This was the most direct U.S. military intervention in Latin America since the operation in Panama in 1989. Let that sink in. The United States just flew into a sovereign nation, seized its head of state, and brought him back to face American justice without international authorization, without UN approval, without any of the diplomatic niceties that used to govern these things. But Trump didn't stop there. At his Mar-a-Lago press conference, he announced that the United States would run Venezuela until further notice, and that American companies would take control of Venezuela's vast oil reserves, of the largest in the world. And then he invoked the Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old policy that says the entire Western Hemisphere belongs to the American sphere of influence, all the way back dated to the Monroe Doctrine, Trump said. And the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a real lot. They now call it the Monroe Doctrine. Now, you might think this is just Trump being Trump, bluster and bravado, but it's not. This is official United States policy. In November 2025, Trump's administration released a new national security strategy that explicitly declares a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This is a formal government document. It states that the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. The strategy goes further. It says the U.S. will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to own or control strategically vital assets in the Americas. It demands that all American allies in the region must be contingent on winding down adversarial outside influence. Translation? Countries like Canada must cut ties with China or face consequences. And the document specifically targets key strategic locations and continued access to critical supply chains and materials. You know what counts as a key strategic location in North America? The Northwest Passage, the Canadian Arctic, the critical minerals buried beneath Canadian soil. As one analyst at the Hub wrote, Washington views these assets as strategically vital and cannot afford to let Canadian permission be a condition for accessing them. This is not speculation. This is what the document says. Within days of Venezuela, Trump's administration made clear this was just the beginning. Secretary of State Marco Rubio went on television and declared, "This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live, and we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be a base of operation for adversaries, competitors, and rivals of the United States." When asked about potential military action in Colombia, Trump's answer was simple: "Sounds good to me." He threatened Cuba. He said Senator Rubio, whose parents fled Cuba, has been more bullish about targeting Cuba. "If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned," Rubio said. Trump threatened Mexico, saying President Gustavo Petro has to watch his ass. He called Colombia very sick and said American military moves there sound good to me. And then Stephen Miller, one of Trump's most senior advisors, posted a photo of Greenland draped in an American flag with the word soon. His wife, Katie Miller, had posted a similar provocation days earlier. When asked whether military force was on the table for Greenland, a NATO ally, Miller refused to rule it out. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen responded with perhaps the most extraordinary statement any NATO leader has ever made about the United States. If the United States were to choose to move against another NATO country, then everything would come to an end, she said. This would be the end of NATO as we know it. Let that sink in. The leader of a NATO country is publicly discussing the possibility that the United States might move against them militarily. This isn't some fringe politician. This is the Prime Minister of Denmark, a founding member of NATO, speaking on the record. And here's where it gets personal for Canada. Trump has called Canada the 51st state repeatedly. He's imposed devastating tariffs on Canadian goods. He's mocked former Prime Minister Trudeau as Canada's governor. His national security strategy explicitly targets the Western Hemisphere, which includes Canada, as an American sphere of influence. Bob Rae, Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations, put it bluntly after Venezuela, "The Americans are saying things that undermine our future and dictate our future in a way that puts us in an impossible position." He said Canada is on the menu. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy warned, if we simply allow Trump and his crowd to think that they can get away to do whatever they want, to whichever country they want, for whatever reason they want, then we are vulnerable. The Eurasia Group, one of the world's leading political risk firms, just released their Top Risks 2026 report. Their third highest risk globally is what they call the Monroe Doctrine. And they specifically state that outside the US, no other country will be as profoundly affected by Trump's political revolution as Canada. They write, Canada's long-standing relationship with the US, based on ever-increasing economic integration and a rock-solid security partnership, is history. History, that's not hyperbole. That's a major risk analysis firm saying the old Canada-US relationship is finished. So how did Prime Minister Mark Carney respond? His first statement on Venezuela was carefully calibrated. He welcomed the opportunity for freedom, democracy, peace, and prosperity for the Venezuelan people, while calling on all parties to respect international law. Critics called it weak, too diplomatic, not forceful enough. The NDP's interim leader, Don Davies, called Carney's statement mealy-mouthed and a failure to stand up to Trump. But here's what they missed. While Carney was being careful with his words, he was being bold with his actions. First, Carney flew to Paris, not to meet with Americans, but to meet with European allies at a Coalition of the Willing summit on Ukraine. There, surrounded by leaders from over 30 countries, Carney did something remarkable. He stood next to Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, the same leader Trump just threatened over Greenland, and announced that Canada would send its Governor General Mary Simon, who is of Inuk descent, to visit Greenland next month. Canada is also opening a new consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital. The symbolism here is extraordinary. Canada's Governor General is Indigenous, Inuk, the same people who live in Greenland. By sending her to Greenland while Trump threatens to take it by force, Carney is sending an unmistakable message of solidarity. Carney said it directly. The future of Greenland is a decision for Greenland and for Denmark exclusively. It's their decision. He added, "We are partners in NATO. It's a mutual defense alliance. We can provide that security." And then Canada did something even more significant. 6 European nations, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom, issued a joint statement defending Greenland's sovereignty. They wrote, "Greenland belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland and them only to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland." Canada joined that statement, standing with Europe against American threats. But Carney didn't stop there. He announced that Canada and its European allies are close to finalizing security guarantees for Ukraine, guarantees that would commit over 35 countries to protect Ukraine against future Russian aggression. French President Emmanuel Macron called the coalition the beating heart of support for Ukraine. The declaration commits members to support the Ukrainian military as the first line of defense and contribute to a multinational force. This is Canada positioning itself as a leader of the democratic world, not waiting for American permission, not following American leadership, building its own coalitions. To understand what Carney is really doing, you need to look at what happened before Venezuela. In December 2025, Canada became the first non-European country in history to join the European Union's flagship defense program called SAFE, Security Action for Europe. This is a 150 billion euro program designed to rearm Europe. It provides loans for joint military procurement, allowing countries to buy weapons together at massive scale. Under the program, EU member states can access low-interest financing for urgent defense investments. 19 EU countries have already submitted their national defense investment plans under SAFE. Poland requested 43.7 billion euros. Romania requested 19.3 billion. France and Hungary each requested 18.7 billion. This is a massive rearmament effort. Under the deal Carney negotiated, Canadian defense companies can now bid on EU military contracts. Canada can make joint weapons purchases with European countries at preferential prices. European defense investment can flow into Canada. And here's the kicker. Carney has said that more than 70 cents of every dollar Canada spends on military equipment will no longer go to the United States. 70 cents on the dollar. That's a complete restructuring of Canada's defense relationship. The EU-Canada Security and Defense Partnership, signed at the Canada-EU Summit in June 2025, explicitly states that both parties will strengthen joint defense cooperation and create resilient defense supply chains between our industries. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said, "In these geopolitically turbulent times, it is a means to increase cooperation, meet defense targets, and spend better." Defense Minister David McGuinty was even more direct. "We've been allowed to step inside a tent, the European Union tent. We've been allowed to participate like no other non-European state has been allowed." In other words, Canada is building an entirely new military-industrial relationship with Europe to replace its dependence on the United States. And Canada isn't alone. Japan, South Korea, and Turkey all applied to join the SAFE program on December 12th. The UK tried to negotiate entry, but talks collapsed in November. The EU wanted 6.75 billion euros, and the UK offered only 82 million. Canada succeeded where Britain failed. That tells you something about how seriously the EU takes this partnership. The numbers on Canadian defense spending are staggering. Canada's first budget under Carney included $81.8 billion in new defense funding over 5 years. Canada has committed to reaching NATO's 2% of GDP target immediately. But it goes further. NATO countries have now agreed to reach 5% of GDP on defense spending by 2035. For Canada, that means roughly $150 billion annually. This is the largest increase in Canadian military spending in over 70 years, and much of it is specifically earmarked for Arctic defense. $420 million in new funding to boost Canadian Armed Forces presence in the Arctic. A $1 billion fund for dual-use